Welcome everyone. This is Galen Barbos speaking from Berkeley Lab. Today's webinar features some work that is literally hot off the press. This is a report that we just issued earlier this morning with the title shown on this first slide, and is work that was funded by the Department of Energy's Sunshot program. I am joined here by two of the three other co-authors on the report, Naeem Dargouth, who really led this effort and will be the one actually delivering the presentation, and then Ryan Weiser, who many of you know and will be lurking in the background and perhaps emerging from the shadows later on in the webinar. Before I hand off the baton to Naeem, let me just run through some of the typical housekeeping items. So the webinar is scheduled for an hour. I think it'll probably be about 40 minutes or so of actual presentation time, so hopefully we'll have a good 15 or 20 minutes or so at the end for Q&A. You all, however, are in listen-only mode, so please just type any questions that you have into the chat box. I'd encourage you to type in questions as we go through the presentation, and then I'll kind of sort through them, and the three of us can respond collectively at the end. A couple other things. The webinar is being recorded, and I expect that we'll be posting it online over the next couple days or so in case any of you want to come back to it at another time. And then lastly, the report itself is, of course, available online now, as well as a PowerPoint briefing, which I think probably looks an awful lot like the slides that we'll be going through here shortly. And so we'll provide a URL for our publication page at the end of the presentation where you can download these documents. So with that, Naeem, I will pass this off to you.
Excellent. Thank you, and welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. I'm Naeem Dargouth in the Electricity Markets and Policy Group here at Berkeley Lab, and I'll be presenting key findings from the report that we released this morning entitled Net Metering and Market Feedback Loops, Exploring the Impact of Retail Rate Design on Distributed PV Deployment. So, as most of you know, we've seen an incredible growth in the U.S. distributed PV market, over 400% increase in capacity in the last 5 years. And this has been driven by about a 50% decrease in installed prices from 2009 to 2014, as well as support policies at the local, state, and federal levels, and new financing options. All this makes solar more affordable to the customer. Now, net metering, which in most cases effectively compensates solar generation at whatever electricity rate the customer is on, is one of the most important support policies, and increasingly so as incentive levels are tapering off. With the increase in PV levels, combined with net metering policies in most states, there's been a fair amount of discussion and debate about potential financial impacts on electric utilities as well as electricity customers. These concerns stem from the potential undercollection of a utility's fixed costs from PV customers. An increasing number of states with active PV markets are turning to changing potentially electricity rate designs, as well as potentially modifying net metering rules. So these potential changes are meant to address the fixed cost recovery concerns, among other things, but modifying these would also have implications for PV host customers. Changing rate design or net metering rules would likely change the value of PV to the customer, and hence affect the decision on whether a customer will install PV or not. And of course, this will have impacts on future overall PV deployment trajectories. In this study, we look at how rate design and PV compensation mechanisms may impact future PV deployment in the U.S. So as we look into the issues that relate to electricity rates and PV deployment, there are two important market feedback effects that we consider. So the first is the fixed cost recovery feedback, Now, with increasing net metered PV, utilities recover their fixed costs over a decreasing number of kilowatt hours sold, and this could potentially lead to increasing retail rate levels. Depending on how the customer is compensated for their PV generation, higher electricity rate levels could improve the value of solar for PV customers and further accelerate PV deployment. Now, you may have heard about this before, as it's been given a rather ominous name, utility death spiral by some people, a spiral of increasing rates in PV deployment. But there's another PV deployment feedback effect, which is less often considered and discussed, one related to time-varying rates. So as we've seen with the infamous duck curve, net demand, or total demand minus the distributed PV generation, will likely peak later in the day as PV levels increase. And electricity prices will also peak later in the day. And so time-varying rates, such as time of use or real-time pricing rates, will adjust such that their peak price periods will also shift to later in the day. So what this means for customers under time-varying rates is that their PV bill savings would drop. This, in turn, would lead to a dampening in PV deployment as PV becomes less economical for potential PV customers under time-varying rates. So this feedback effect between PV deployment and bill savings from PV is in the opposite direction as the fixed cost recovery feedback effect that I just mentioned. So when modeling future PV deployment under various rate design scenarios, we really must take both of these feedback effects into account. So this leads us to the two principal objectives of the work. So the first is to examine how changes in retail rate structures and the way PV is compensated could impact overall distributed PV deployment in the US. To do this, we consider a number of rate design scenarios, and I'll be presenting and giving some details of those shortly. And then we model PV deployment trajectories for each of those scenarios. Now, the second main objective is to quantify the degree and conditions for which the two feedback effects I just introduced accelerate or dampen down PV deployment. And I'll present a number of results that specifically look at the feedback dynamics and the net effect from the two feedbacks. Related to our objectives are our unique contributions to the discussion. So there have been a number of previous studies that have examined various impacts of rate design on the PV value to the customer or bill savings from PV, including a few by our group here at Berkeley Lab. But these haven't generally translated into impacts on PV deployment. When deployment has been explored, it's really been limited in scope and hasn't considered the feedback effects that I introduced previously. So this is really a unique effort to quantify impacts of rate design and PV compensation on PV deployment. Understanding these deployment impacts will really be important for decision makers as they consider potential changes to retail rates, given the continued role that PV may play in advancing energy and environmental policy objectives, as well as improving customer choice. So the study's second significant contribution is that this is the first study, to our knowledge, that looks at both the fixed cost recovery feedback and the time-varying rate feedback effects. So far, we've mostly seen conceptual discussions of feedback, and it's mostly focused on the fixed cost recovery positive feedback. We model and quantify the potential impacts of both the feedback effects. So let's now start digging into the meat of the report, starting with the methodology. So The model we used for the analysis is a version of the Solar Deployment System Model, or Solar DS, which was originally developed at the National Renewable Energy Lab. The model simulates the future adoption of distributed PV using a bottoms-up approach with data from more than 216 solar resource regions throughout the country and more than 2,000 electric utilities to determine the customer economics of PV, and from that, the number of PV adopters in each region. So the calculations that determine customer economics of PV consider solar resources, utility retail rates, state and federal incentives, solar adoption curves that link payback time of PV to market adoption rates, solar appropriate roof space, PV system size, and of course upfront PV system cost. We assume an installed price trajectory that achieves the original Department of Energy Sunshot price targets of $1.60 per watt for residential customers and $1.34 per watt for commercial customers in 2020. And these have been converted to 2013 dollars. So the results are then aggregated up to the state level and then again to the national level. For this study, we've updated the model and appropriate inputs with the latest available retail rate levels, retail rate mixes for the different types of rates and projections, but also more importantly, we've augmented the model to incorporate both the fixed cost recovery feedback and the time varying rate feedback effects. And I'll be explaining in the next slide a bit more on how we modeled these. So a couple of things to note about the model we use. First, the model is not equipped to evaluate storage solutions or defection decisions. So we recognize that there would definitely be a lot of value in looking at storage and see this really as a future important contribution, but the analysis probably wouldn't use the Solar DS model. Also, this model is really best used for longer-term national deployment assessments. It's really not meant to look at short-term deployment impacts, nor is it particularly appropriate to model individual utilities or states, as it won't necessarily capture a state's particular idiosyncrasies that could impact local deployment. So I'd like to talk a bit on how each of the two feedback effects was modeled, at least at a conceptual level. So first, the fixed cost recovery feedback. So when PV is compensated at a retail rate greater than the utility's avoided cost from PV, we increase the retail rate so that the utility still achieves full cost recovery. For the utility avoided cost calculation, we really narrowly focus on the value of PV in offsetting utility costs. And this includes the energy value from PV, its capacity value, and a miscellaneous other value, which encompasses things like avoided transmission and distribution losses, transmission distribution capacity offsets, or other economic cost savings. We assume energy and capacity value decline for PV with increasing levels of regional PV penetration. And we base the rate of decrease on findings from previous work in this area, particularly earlier papers by Andrew Mills and Ryan Weiser, also in our Berkeley Lab group. So we do exclude any additional benefits to society in the avoided cost calculations that aren't explicitly monetized by the utilities. And we also exclude shorter-term consumer benefits from lower average wholesale prices. And I should note that the fixed cost recovery adder is modeled at the state level and separately for residential and commercial customers. So next, for the time varying rate feedback for customers who are under a time of use or a real-time rate of some kind, compensation for PV depends on the coincidence between PV generation and peak price periods. And as peak price periods shift towards later in the evening, as PV penetrations increases, the coincidence decreases with, again, increasing levels of PV. And this decrease in compensation is assumed to be at the same rate as the reductions in energy and capacity value resulting from increased PV penetration levels. So let's dive into the 8 rate design and PV compensation scenarios that we considered in our analysis. These are certainly pertinent and representative scenarios that in some cases are being considered by states or utilities, policymakers and regulators, but by no means are these intended to be exhaustive. It is just a subset of possible rate design scenarios. So our first scenario is our reference scenario, which we use as a baseline throughout the study. It assumes a continuation of the current mix of rate designs. So the percentage of customers facing flat rates, time varying rates, and for commercial customers, demand charges, this mix is static and based on published data as well as previous solar DS assumptions. We assume full net metering for this reference scenario, where all customer PV generation is compensated at a fully volumetric retail rate. So we then constructed 2 scenarios with residential monthly fixed customer charges, one at a $10 a month level and one at a $50 a month level. These scenarios are similar to the reference scenario, but the volumetric portion of the rate, which really is the only portion of the rate that PV customers can displace, is adjusted downwards so that the utility recovers the same amount of revenue when you include the fixed charges. For the flat rate scenario, all customers are assumed to be on an all volumetric flat rate. For the time varying scenario, all customers are assumed to be on time varying rate. And these 2 scenarios are really designed to bound the potential rate mix options. Now, the next scenario is a different flavor of net metering. We call it partial net metering, but it could be named differently by others. In this scenario, customers are allowed to displace their instantaneous consumption with PV generation, but any electricity exported to the grid is compensated at an avoided cost rate. And again, that avoided cost rate is related to the energy and capacity value of PV for a given region at a given penetration level. The last 2 scenarios that we consider are the feed-in tariff scenarios, which are simple feed-in tariffs. 100% of PV compensation is at a fixed level for all customers and doesn't vary either with time or PV penetration. We consider the lower feed-in tariff at 7 cents a kilowatt hour and a higher feed-in tariff at 15 cents a kilowatt hour. So now that I've gone through some of the methods and data used to conduct the analysis, let's jump into the results. So the first part of the results that I'll be presenting focuses on the impacts of the electricity rate design and PV compensation mechanism on PV deployment. And I'll be presenting PV deployment trends for the 8 scenarios. And all of these account for the 2 feedback mechanisms. It's later, after that, that I'll be discussing the feedback-related results. So first, here are the deployment results for the reference scenario with net metering. This figure shows how U.S. distributed PV deployment increases with time from 2014 through to 2050. The shape of the curve is a result of the dynamics between electricity rates, capital costs, and other inputs to the model. And we find that the aggregate PV deployment rises to about 157 gigawatts in 2050 for the reference scenario. So note that this figure, as well as the other figures that I'll be presenting in the following slides, really only focus on distributed PV, as this is what we're modeling, and so exclude any utility scale solar. That would be in addition to these results. So the next set of slides compares the 7 other scenarios to the reference scenario, the one you're seeing here, and really highlight how sensitive PV deployment is to the customer's underlying rate design and PV compensation mechanism. So the first result is for the flat rate scenario with net metering, where we assume that all customers are on a flat all volumetric rate. And as we can see in the figure here, we find that this scenario only modestly increases PV deployment when compared with a reference scenario. The flat rate is more favorable to PV customers than demand charges for commercial customers, and at higher PV penetration levels, the flat rate is more favorable than the time varying rate. But many of the residential customers are already on the flat rate here in the reference scenario. So here we see the results for the scenario, the 2 scenarios, the $10 and $50 residential fixed customer charges, and both which assume net metering. In both cases, the volumetric portion of the retail rate, which is effectively the compensation rate for PV generation, is lower than in the reference case. Both scenarios lead to a reduction in installed PV, but the $50 monthly charge is especially damaging to PV deployment, as we see in the dashed orange line here. So here we see the results for the scenario where we do away with full net metering and replace it with our partial net metering, where again the portion of PV generated that's exported to the grid in excess of the customer's instantaneous consumption is compensated at a calculated utility avoided cost. And these avoided costs are generally lower than the full retail rate, and further reduced with time as regional PV penetration increases. So this leads to lower PV deployment levels under the partial net metering scenario compared with our full net metering reference scenario. So in this figure, we see the deployment pattern for the time varying rate scenario, where all customers are assumed to adopt the time varying rate. So through about 2030, we see that the deployment is actually higher than for the reference case, whereas deployment then drops below the reference scenario through to 2050. Now, this is because in the short term, bill savings from the time varying rate are greater than under a flat all volumetric rate, given the reasonably favorable coincidence between PV generation and peak electricity prices. But as PV penetrations increase and peak electricity prices shift towards the evening time, the time varying rate feedback dampens PV deployment. So now turning to the last 2 scenarios that we considered, the 2 feed-in tariff levels, we find that the impact of the feed-in tariff, which could also be a value of solar tariff, really completely depends on the value of that feed-in tariff. When the tariff is set to a level higher than the customer's retail rates, PV deployment increases relative to the reference scenario, and when the tariff is set to a lower level than the customer's retail rate, PV deployment decreases relative to the reference scenario. So the next figure, the one here, summarizes the U.S. PV deployment results for each scenario through 2050. So again, the flat rate and the higher feed-in tariff lead to an increase in PV deployment compared to the reference scenario. In all other scenarios we considered lead to a decrease in PV deployment. Now, to go through some of the numbers here, when compared with our reference scenario, cumulative distributed PV in 2050 is about 15% lower with the $10 per month residential customer charge, and about 60% lower with a $50 customer charge. Deployment is roughly 30% lower with our partial net metering scenario. With the time-varying rate scenario, overall deployment is about 20% lower than our reference scenario in 2050. And with the feed-in tariffs, the direction as well as the magnitude of the impact really is completely dependent on how the feed-in tariff compares with underlying retail rate levels. So until now, our discussion has been entirely for the results at the national level. However, there are differences in results from one state to the next, and this is going to depend on solar resources, on retail rate levels and mixes, as well as the regional PV penetration levels. So the figure here shows the state-level variation for the results I presented for 2050. So the box plots here represent the 10th, 25th, 50th, 75th, and 90th percentile state-level value. So the fixed charge scenarios on the left decrease deployment in all states, and the range is pretty small among the states. For most states, the all-flat scenario leads to an increase in PV deployment in 2050 compared with the reference scenario. The range, again, is quite modest, and this is because a large percentage of customers are already on flat rates. So the range is much more significant for the time-varying rate scenario. As we see here, about for 75% of states, switching all customers to a time-varying rate is going to reduce cumulative deployment of PV in 2050. And the states that are at the bottom tail end that are most affected by this scenario are going to be those with the highest PV deployment, where the energy and capacity value of PV erodes the most, along with PV compensation. In regions with relatively low PV penetration, PV compensation under time-varying rates remains higher than under the average rate, leading to higher deployment. Now, partial net metering reduces deployment for all states, and the magnitude really depends on the relationship between avoided costs and the retail rate compensation. The change from net metering to feed-in tariff produce a potentially large range of deployment impacts. The lower feed-in tariff is lower than all average PV compensation levels under the reference scenario, so leads to a lower PV deployment level for all states. For the higher feed-in tariff, it's a bit more complicated, and there's a larger range just because states whose retail rates are lower than the feed-in tariff level leads to an increase in deployment and vice versa. So again, that explains this large range that we see here. So now let's turn to the second part of the results, those related to the feedback effects from increased PV penetration levels. Again, we modeled two feedback effects, one related to fixed cost recovery, resulting from the increase in retail rates that may be necessary to recover utility fixed costs, and the other to time-varying rates, where bill savings for PV customers decline under time-varying rates due to the reduced value of PV for the customer as peak prices shift towards the evening time. So we've modeled the reference case with and without feedback to quantify and isolate the deployment impact from the feedback effect. In the figure here on the right, we show the deployment for both cases in the reference scenario. The orange dashed line is the feedback case, and the black line is the no feedback case. And as we see, the combined impact of the two feedback effects never increases deployment greatly above the no feedback case in the reference scenario. In 2030, the total U.S. deployment is about 1% higher for the feedback case than for the no feedback case, and about 2% higher in 2050. But to understand what's going on here, we need to disaggregate the two feedback effects and see how each of them lead to this combined feedback effect. And surprise, this is what I'm showing here. So the figure here shows each of the feedback effects individually, as well as the combined effect for the reference scenario, as a percentage change from the no feedback case. So the green dashed line on the top is a change in deployment owing to the fixed cost recovery feedback. The red or orange dotted line on the bottom is a change owing to the time varying rate feedback, and the solid blue or black line in the middle is the result for the two feedbacks combined. So what we had observed in the previous slide, the rather moderate level of combined feedback, is actually the result of the two more significant and opposing feedback effects. If we only consider the fixed cost recovery feedback, PV deployment increases 8% over the case without any feedback by 2050. On the other hand, if we only consider the time varying rate feedback, PV deployment decreases by about 5% compared with a no feedback case. So again, the two feedback mechanisms are canceling one another to a large extent. And again, these results here are our reference case assumptions and at an aggregated national level. So the feedback effects also differ between residential and commercial customers because of the different retail rate mixes of each. The figure here shows the combined feedback effect for the residential customers, which is the orange dashed line, the combined feedback effect for commercial customers, which is the bottom dashed gray line, and again, the combined feedback effect for all customers, which is equivalent to the combined one in the last slide, which is the solid blue line. So for since most residential customers face a flat volumetric rate in the reference scenario, residential deployment increases because of the rate feedback that's primarily driven by the fixed cost recovery feedback. And that levels out to just about 9% over the reference scenario without feedback. And this is in contrast, of course, to most commercial customers who often face time varying rates and hence see a 15% decrease in total commercial deployment compared with a no feedback case. And again, because this reduction in commercial deployment is due to the reduced value that the customers receive from PV. Because commercial PV deployment estimated by SolarDS is lower than residential deployment, the net effect of the feedbacks over both customer segments is only slightly positive by 2050. So until now, the feedback results that I presented were at the national level. At the state level, however, feedback effects can vary due to differences in retail rate levels, PV penetration, and the percentage of customers on flat versus time varying rates. So in the figure here on your left, we show the change in deployment from the reference scenario without feedback, and again with box plots that show the 10th, 25th, 50th, 75th, and 90th percentile values among states for residential customers in the left bar, commercial customers in the center bar, and all customers on the right bar. For the residential sector, the left bar, the combined feedback effect increased PV deployment for most states, with a net effect ranging from 2 to 6% increase in deployment for the middle 50% of states. States with higher residential PV penetrations, who are mostly on flat rates, experience much stronger feedback effects. A state with a higher percentage of residential customers on time-varying rates, or that have lower PV penetrations, will have a lower net feedback effect. So because, again, most commercial customers are already on time-varying rates, the two feedback mechanisms lead to a net decrease in commercial PV deployment in most states. The magnitude of that decrease will vary substantially, as we see here, from one state to another, because the change in energy and capacity value due to increased regional PV penetration also varies substantially from one region to the next. So when we consider both residential and commercial customers and both feedback effects, most states have a negative total feedback effect. And this is in slight contrast to what we saw in previous slides, where the national feedback effect was positive 2% in 2050. And this is because the national results are more significantly influenced by states with large PV markets. And regardless, despite the widespread literature that suggests a positive feedback effect, really our results suggest that the combined effect of the two relevant feedbacks, at least in our reference case, is generally modest and often negative. And the range among states is also relatively small. So the feedback results that I've discussed until now have been for the reference scenario, which assumes residential and commercial rate distributions that are based on current levels. Of course, there are uncertainties in the future mix of customers on flat volumetric rates versus time-varying rates. So the all-flat scenario and the all-time-varying scenarios, where 100% of customers are either on one rate or the other, really bound the feedback results when it comes to rate mix assumptions. So the three panels on the left here show the deployment trends with and without feedback for the reference scenario. The all-flat scenario, where all customers are under a flat rate, and the all-time varying scenario on the bottom, where all customers are under a time-varying rate. The feedback curve in all three is the dashed orange line, and the no feedback curve is the black solid line. For the flat rate scenario, feedback increases PV deployment by 8% in 2050, whereas for the time-varying scenario, feedback reduces deployment by about 25% in 2050. Now, given the generally expected move over time towards time-differentiated rates for many states, it seems that PV deployment feedback effects may predominantly be in the negative direction as PV penetrations increase. So let's wrap up this webinar, or the presentation part of the webinar, with some takeaway points and conclusions. So accounting for the two feedback effects I discussed, we find that retail rate design and PV compensation mechanisms can really have a dramatic impact on the projected level of PV deployment. One example is if more people in the future are under time-varying rates, then we'd expect an increase in PV deployment in the medium term, but a reduced deployment in the longer term. And again, the changing pattern of deployment over time relative to the reference case is a result of the decrease in the energy and capacity value of PV as PV penetrations increase. And that decrease in value then trickles down into the time-varying rate. In part to address concerns about the fixed cost feedback effect, many utilities, regulators, states, policymakers have proposed increased fixed customer charges, especially for residential customers, and possibly even a phase out of net energy metering. Our analysis suggests that a natural outcome of these changes would be a substantial reduction in the future deployment of PV. So policymakers are really going to need to weigh these impacts against the many other considerations when making rate design decisions. So the second main takeaway is related to the feedback effects. As we all know, there's been a lot of discussion on the issues related to fixed cost recovery with increasing levels of net meter PV, and talk about the ominous utility death spiral. Some people are expressing concern that if PV deployment causes electricity rates to increase, then net metered PV would become even more attractive for consumers, further accelerating PV deployment and leading to additional electricity rate hikes. So, I mean, our results definitely don't speak to the question of the so-called death of the utility, but they do show that concerns about the feedback effect, at least on the national basis, may be somewhat overstated, and that the actual feedback effects are really quite nuanced. Also, our analysis didn't include storage or how loads may change, and it's hard to say what's going to happen to storage in the longer term or how customers may react to changing rate structures. Current debates tend to really focus only on the fixed cost recovery feedback, and so miss this important and opposing feedback mechanism that can offset the issue of concern. In fact, there seems to be a general move towards default time-varying rates, and this would suggest an overall dampening in PV deployment, not an accelerating one. So with that, I'd like to thank you again for joining us today. We will have a question and answer session shortly. So you can download the full report by going to our publications page. The link is right here. Below here is our contact information if you'd like to get in touch with us directly. If please also feel free to connect with me via LinkedIn to stay in touch. I'd like to thank, of course, the Department of Energy's Solar and Energy Technologies Office for funding this work. So Galen has been compiling the questions as they've been coming in, and Ryan Weiser is also on the line here. And Ryan and Galen will join me for the remainder of our time for the question and answer session.
All right, thanks, Naeem. So yes, I have been sorting through the many questions that have been flowing in over the last 40 minutes or so. So we'll try to get through as many of these as possible. Probably what we'll do is just I'll kind of paraphrase groups of questions since we won't be able to kind of go through them one by one. So we had a bunch of questions that related to the fixed cost recovery feedback element. And so some of the questions related to sort of how distribution system costs were incorporated into that feedback mechanism. We had some questions about carbon costs. We had some questions about whether that feedback was sort of computed annually or over some other frequency. So maybe, Naeem, you can kind of just say a little bit more about kind of the mechanics of how we sort of modeled, albeit in a simplified way, that feedback, and maybe kind of try to touch on those things I just mentioned.
Absolutely. So basically, to come up with our fixed cost recovery adder, so the portion of the rate that's added to the already existing rate, we compared the existing retail rate to the avoided cost of the utility. Um, and the avoided cost of the utility, as I mentioned, includes an energy charge, a capacity value for the PV, as well as a miscellaneous charge. Now, the energy and capacity values decrease with increasing PV penetration, and again, that was modeled using results from previous studies that have looked at that decrease in value. And we've lumped in the others, so the distribution benefits, the T&D losses, in a single element, so a miscellaneous value. There's quite a lot of variability from one utility service territory to the next, and even one distribution feeder to the next. And so we've kind of used from a 1 cent a kilowatt hour value for all these miscellaneous costs, and we've loosely based that on a literature review that we did. These are calculated on an annual basis, so the fixed cost recovery adder is recalculated every year with the new PV penetration levels.
Okay, let's see. So we had also a bunch of storage-related questions, and I know, Naeem, you indicated that we didn't really include storage in this analysis. Is there anything that you can say, or Ryan, about what, how increasing penetration and reduced costs for behind-the-meter storage might impact some of the dynamics that we've looked at?
Sure. I'm happy to take that one too. So we would expect with increasing amounts of storage in the system, so two potential things. The first is, with more storage, we would see in the wholesale electricity market less of a clear difference between the off-peak and peak periods, because with storage, you'd basically be doing arbitrage between the on-peak and off-peak storage, and that would make the off-peak prices a little bit higher and the on-peak prices lower. What that would mean is the shift that I was talking about in peak prices to the evening hours wouldn't be as pronounced, and so the loss in value to the PV customer through time varying rates would also not be as pronounced. So I would expect with more storage, less of this dampening effect that we've seen. At the same time, if storage is inexpensive enough, especially at an individual level, differentiating from utility scale storage, then we could envision a future where people decide to remove themselves from the grid entirely, just with a PV system and a storage system. Given economies of scale, a utility scale storage may be less expensive option, and so that may not happen to a wide extent, but that's really predicting the future.
Let's see. We've got so many folks asked whether we have state-level PV deployment projections available from this work, and although the model does develop those projections, what we've really focused on here is kind of national level results, and with some information on just how those results can vary across states. There was one question, or actually several questions in here related to some of the rate design changes that are kind of underway in California. And so can you, Naeem, or Ryan, talk at all about how some of these results might differ, or what the implications might be for these results from some of the kind of recent changes in California, namely the collapsing of the 4 tiers down to 2, and the introduction of default TOU with minimum bills?
Ryan, maybe you can take the tiering and default, and I can talk about the minimum bill.
Sure, but I was planning on lurking for the entire time. Yeah, so I think let me talk about, I guess, time of use first. So presuming that time of use is the default, and presuming that solar customers remain on TOU, that is, don't opt out of time of use rates, then we would anticipate that, especially at growing levels of solar penetration, the shifting of TOU price periods into the early evening hours will progressively, at higher and higher levels of solar penetration in California, reduce the amount of effective compensation that PV customers receive, and therefore also dampen deployment to some degree, again, at high levels of penetration. That, though, does presume that solar customers remain on the default TOU rate. If instead solar customers are given the option, as other customers are, to opt out of the TOU rate and stay on a flat rate, then they may prefer to do so. Now, of course, all of this presumes no change to net metering, and there's a whole other proceeding on that in California, so I think one needs to be a little bit careful not to kind of overstate the case as it relates to these decisions so far. But certainly as it relates to the TOU issue, again, presuming that solar customers stay on that rate, that would certainly suggest a slight dampening in deployment over time as PV penetrations increase.
And I can also talk a little bit about the minimum bill and what that, how that may impact the results that we've found. So by adding a minimum bill, you're effectively lowering the average economical PV system size for customers. So without a minimum bill, given the low avoided cost-based rates for PV generation beyond a customer's annual consumption in California, the average annual bill is what determines the maximum PV system size, effectively, for which it makes economic sense to install. So adding a minimum bill would reduce that system size, since now the customer's PV generation can only displace the annual bill minus the total annual minimum bill. And so I would expect this to result in lower deployment numbers, but not maybe so significantly, given that a lot of the systems out there are not sized to cover 100% of their annual bill anyway, and particularly because tiering doesn't provide incentives to do so in California. So if deployment is lower, then the fixed cost recovery feedback would be lower, as would the time varying feedback. But again, given that I wouldn't really expect a large decrease in deployment. I'd similarly not expect a large impact on the feedback effect.
All right, one last question here, or sort of compilation of questions. So we had a number of questions that related to how we modeled really kind of PV deployment, but also the feedback mechanisms in states with restructured retail markets where customers are taking service from wires-only utilities and may be able to switch to other retail suppliers. Naeem, can you say anything at all about whether or not the model that we use kind of distinguish between those kinds of markets and how they may have affected some of the mechanics and dynamics that we were modeling?
Sure. So we don't take into account explicitly different models of utility business models. So either vertically integrated or wires only or something in between. That said, I don't think there would be a large difference in our results, given that the capacity and energy values are not determined by the utility that's selling electricity to you, but either it's the capacity value on the wholesale market, or the energy value on the wholesale market, or if it's a vertically integrated utility, the capacity value to that utility. And if it's a wires only, again, the energy is being purchased, either through some kind of long-term contracts or on the wholesale market. So I wouldn't expect. So I guess to conclude, I wouldn't expect a big difference. But no, we did not model those explicit business models.
Okay, well, thanks, Naeem. So we are at the top of the hour, which means our webinar will end here shortly. I just want to thank all of you for joining, and thank all of you, or many of you, for sending in really great questions. As Naeem mentioned, the report and all of the sort of ancillary materials are available. We also have an email distribution list if you aren't already on it and would like to receive occasional emails from us about new publications. You can hopefully navigate your way to that sign-up page from the URL shown here. And then last, as I mentioned at the beginning, a recording of this webinar will be posted online in due time next to the report on the sort of the landing page for the report. So if for some reason you'd like to have a rerun of this webinar, you can do so. So with that, I will conclude and thank you all, and see you next time.